Everyone, this is what your pastor and tell you. I am on with Aren Wilson-Wright. We're going to be talking about early alphabetic inscriptions. How did we get the earliest writings, and how do they relate to Hebrew and Egyptian and all that fun stuff? How are you doing today, Dr. Wilson-Wright? Is that
Yeah,
how
doing
you say
yeah, that's good. Yeah, doing really well. Thank you so much for having me on the channel.
Cool, awesome. Okay, so yeah, what's your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I received my PhD in 2016 from the University of Texas at Austin in Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near East. And I guess I would say my research has two sort of big focal areas. One is the religions of ancient Israel. That's kind of what my dissertation was indirectly on. And then the other is early alphabetic epigraphy. And sort of the themes that connect these two are one, kind of big ideas that are still with us today. So, alphabetic writing, monotheism, really important concepts that are still important today. And then the other concept is contact between Egypt and various Semitic speaking populations. So, Israelites, Canaanites, groups like that. And so, yeah, my dissertation and my first book was kind of more on the religion side, looking at the transmission of the goddess Othart in the Late Bronze Age, looking at contact between the Levant and Egypt and how Othart came to be adopted into the Egyptian pantheon. And then my second book, which just came out, I think, last week, Jeremiah's Egypt, um, is looking at the references to Egypt in the book of Jeremiah and arguing that
Mm.
these reflect a particular time period in Egypt. So the Sayyid period, or the 26th dynasty, arguing that, you know, in the book of Jeremiah, right, Babylon is very important, cast a really long shadow on the book, but Egypt is almost as important. And I argue that, actually, rather than it just being, Babylon coming in and taking over Israel, really it's more of this clash between Babylon and Egypt, and they're fighting over the Levant, and Israel is kind of caught in the middle. And there's sort of two
Wow.
different camps, right? There's the pro-Babylon camp, to which the historical prophet Jeremiah seems to have belonged to, based on, the oracle saying, we need to surrender to Babylon, um, and a pro-Egypt group that, like, kept wanting to go back. They got benefits from being allied to the Egyptians,
Hmm.
and kind of like kept being like, we need to go back to Egypt, or like go back with the Egyptians, even though the Babylonians are coming, because they obviously don't like that. So, yeah, kind of a new perspective on the book of Jeremiah that centers Egypt a little bit more.
Very fascinating. We'll have to talk about that sometime, and maybe even talk about it later if we have some extra time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and then your future. What are your plans for the future as far as scholarship goes?
Yeah, so I really haven't had a chance to do kind of a book length exploration of early alphabetic epigraphy. And so I'd really like to yeah, write a book on these early alphabetic inscriptions that we're going to be talking about today. I think um, the sort of last critical edition was about 17 years ago. Some of the
Mm.
inscriptions that we'll talk about have been lost and relocated. We have new photographic techniques. So I think a lot of pieces are in place to like really get new results and uncover new information about these inscriptions. So yeah, that's what I would love to work on in the future.
Awesome. Really, really cool stuff. Okay, so yeah, I mean, let's just dive into it. So,
Sure.
when talking about the early alphabetic inscriptions, can you talk about the nature of the different types of sources? We can go bit by bit, like just context, content, dating, any of that stuff. We can go just context, or you can talk about just like the context of each, or I don't know what your plan is with that, but just go ahead and dive into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe I'll just talk about the different sites that have yielded early
Okay.
alphabetic inscriptions, and then that'll get us into content and dating. So I guess to start with, like the main site, the one that has yielded the most early alphabetic inscriptions, Serebit al-Khadim in the Sinai Peninsula. So this is an Egyptian turquoise mining facility that's in the Sinai. This is where Egypt got a lot of its turquoise. Basically for thousands of years. They're Old Kingdom inscriptions, so these are from when the pyramids are built, maybe around 2300 BCE. A lot of inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom, so more like 2000 to like 770 BCE approximately, and then there are a couple New Kingdom inscriptions as well. So the site is used for a long time. Like the turquoise mines there apparently had a lot of turquoise. I don't really know very much about turquoise mining, but it was in use for a long period of time. It kind of has two parts to the site. So there are the mines themselves where the mining was done, and then there's also this very large temple to the goddess Hathor, who is kind of the patron deity of turquoise. She's called she's called the Lady of Turquoise, and the Egyptians offered sacrifices and votive offerings, hoping to find lots of turquoise when they went there. This is not a site that's occupied year round. It's in the Sinai Peninsula. It's not the most hospitable place, so they would really just go like for a season and then come back with the yield of turquoise that they had found. And this site has yielded a lot of Egyptian inscriptions, several hundred, in fact. As well as, I think, now about 45 early alphabetic inscriptions. There are a couple that were found in the temple itself. There's the most famous, which is Sinai 345. These are all kind of numbered. When the original publication came out, the Egyptian inscriptions were numbered 1 to 344, and then I think they had found 7 early alphabetic inscriptions at that point, and those were numbered 345 to 352 or 351 or something like that. And then they kind of reserved some space in case more early alphabetic inscriptions were discovered, which was smart because, 30 plus more inscriptions have been subsequently found from Serbia al-Khadim, which is quite nice. It's quite a haul from this time period.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the most famous inscription, Sinai 345, is found in the temple itself. It's on a votive sandstone sphinx. And it's particularly nice because it seems to be sort of pseudo-bilingual. It has both alphabetic writing on one side of the sphinx and hieroglyphic writing on the other side. And we'll come back to why that's important here in a second. So yeah, a lot of inscriptions. There have been multiple expeditions to Serebit al-Khadim over the years. The first was in 1904, 1905. The famous archaeologist, Egyptologist William Flinders Petrie goes and he discovers kind of the first 7. And then there are subsequent expeditions by University of Helsinki, Harvard University. A nature photographer in the 60s happens to find 2 or 3 new inscriptions. Hebrew University finds some inscriptions in the late 70s, early 80s. There's a French expedition later. So, all these inscriptions just keep piling up. So in the end, they're about like 45-ish, although there are a couple inscriptions where it's like, is this really an inscription? Is this just marks in the rock? Like, what is this? So yeah, the number is a little bit fuzzy in terms of the numbers, but lots and lots of material, particularly compared to the other sites that we'll talk about. So
very fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep on.
So the next site that's yielded sort of early alphabetic inscriptions is Wadi al-Hol, which is a wadi in Egypt. It's near the first cataract. In the what's known as the Qena bend of the Nile. So like the Nile kind of bends around. And, normally you would kind of take a boat along the Nile and take that. But because it like bowed out, there was a road that kind of like bypassed the bow. So it'd be like a little bit faster to take it. So it's this like Egyptian military road if you needed to go really fast. And the walls of the wadi, so the sandstone walls there, have a ton of Egyptian inscriptions written in them, some by soldiers that are passing through, some by pilgrims or just people who are taking like a day trip even, just happen to like write something. in the walls of the wadi. And during a survey of all these inscriptions in the 1990s, two sort of non-Egyptian inscriptions were found: Wadi al-Hol 1 and Wadi al-Hol 2. And these were photographed, subsequently published in, I believe, 2006. And yeah, they seem to be early alphabetic inscriptions. The letter shapes are very similar to what we see in the inscriptions from Sarabi al-Khadim. There, of course, as we'll see with a lot of these inscriptions, there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of like weirdness going on, and so those inscriptions are still not fully understood, even to the extent that we understand the inscriptions from Sarabi al-Khadim. And then finally, there are like a couple random finds, I guess. There's what's known as the Lahoon heddlejack, which is this like piece of wood that's used in weaving to like separate the fibers, and it has early alphabetic letters on it. It was one of the inscriptions that kind of was lost. People didn't know where it was, and then it was rediscovered in the 2000s and re-photographed and republished. Then there's the Der Rifa seal, which is, again, another seal, I think, that was found in one of Petrie's excavations. And I think maybe, again, in the 2000s, someone looked at it. It was thought that it had like pseudo writing on it, that it was just like meant to look like writing, but it wasn't really. And someone looked at it again and said, hey, I think this might actually be early alphabetic. Like, here's a comparison to what we have from Sarabi al-Khadim, from Wadi al-Hol. And it seems pretty, his argument is pretty convincing, I think, that this is probably alphabetic writing. So a lot of stuff from Egypt and Egyptian-controlled sites like Sarabi al-Khadim. Then like maybe a couple inscriptions from the Levant. So the Lakish dagger is thought to date to like the 17th century BCE, but it's from a tomb. So it's a little harder to, date that concretely and say like we know exactly when this dates. There was, I think, maybe 2 years ago in 2021, another inscription from Lakish found, a potsherd that was found in a controlled archaeological excavation that probably dates to the 15th century. So kind of a common theme with a lot of these is that they're either were discovered a long time ago when archaeological methods were still a little immature, and we don't really have a good way of dating them because the records weren't kept very well, or they're from contexts that are very hard to date, right? A rock wall on a wadi, I mean, how do you date when people inscribed the wall, right? Like, there's nothing that can really tell you that. Similarly for a lot of the stuff at Sarabi al-Khadim, right? It's on the walls outside of the mines, pretty hard to date. So that kind of takes us into to the dating of these inscriptions. So when the inscriptions from Sarabit were first published, Petrie, who discovered them, thought they're maybe New Kingdom date, so maybe like 14th, 15th century. And the first person to like really work on the inscriptions and like find a way to like read a couple of the letters and even read a single word that we still kind of recognize as being correct. Sir Alan Gardner, famous Egyptologist, he favored a Middle Kingdom date. And we can talk about kind of the reasoning why we have these two rival dates. So the reason for, or the evidence for a New Kingdom date, rather, is that in one of the mines where the turquoise was mined, there was an inscription, Sinai 357, and Petrie had found a pottery sherd in the mine that was dated from the New Kingdom. And then there was also a couple of these inscriptions, so Sinai 345, the famous Sphinx. There are a couple other Sphinxes, Sinai 346, 347, and 347A. He thought, typologically, these look like they come from the New Kingdom. And there are a couple other arguments regarding kind of the use of sandstone for statuettes. That was only seen in the New Kingdom. So that was kind of his evidence for dating these to the New Kingdom. Gardner, on the other hand, having kind of gained a better understanding of the language of the inscriptions, certainly, and a little bit of the content, right? He recognized that these were in a Semitic language, said, well, to have inscriptions in a Semitic language, you need people who speak a Semitic language at the site, presumably, right? So he looked at the Egyptian inscriptions, and what's really convenient about a lot of these Egyptian inscriptions is that they mention the content of the expeditions. Sometimes in great detail. They'll mention like the cook, the person who drove the donkeys, how many men from each contingent are there. So with that information, you can kind of get a better understanding of, who was at Sarabit al-Khadim. And in the Middle Kingdom inscriptions, there are a lot of references to a group known as the Amu, which is the Egyptian term for people who are from the Levant. There's also many references to a group known as the Men of Rechenu, which is, in the Middle Kingdom at least, the term for people from Syria. So you have lots of references to places where we know people spoke Semitic languages. And we also have, from the Middle Kingdom, references to people with Semitic sounding names who are called, either Amu or Man of Rechenu. And there's even a reference to this guy called Hebded, an Egyptian, probably something like Habidadu in whatever Semitic language he spoke, who's called the brother of the Prince of Rechenu. So there seems to be this like fairly high-ranking official from the Levant who's at the site, and he's even depicted in a couple, I think at least once pictorially, as kind of this typical Levantine individual. He's got one, he's riding a donkey, which is like a very Levantine thing to do. It's not really was done among the Egyptians. They thought that was kind of silly that these people from the Levant rode donkeys. So riding a donkey, he has this distinctive, I believe in the literature it's called a mushroom-shaped haircut. It's basically like he has a bowl cut, which is like distinctive Levantine sort of look. He has a sort of pointy beard, and his retainers in the picture are carrying like these distinctive Levantine swords, throw sticks, things like that. So like he's depicted as like the quintessential like Levantine individual in this pictorial representation.
So, so if we're talking about, what these people look like, and we want to look like them, you're saying that we should get a bowl cut, and is it like a specific kind of bowl cut, or?
Yeah, exactly. So, I think it's like pretty much just like the same length all the way around, like long, pretty long bangs, and then like a pointy, like, I guess it's probably a goatee.
Oh, okay.
Bottom
All
part
right.
is like really
I can do
pointy.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we should definitely bring that style back.
Okay, but keep going.
Sure. And we have the names of like some of the people in his retinue. Some of them seem to be like pretty Semitic seeming, like one, or they're written in Egyptian. They don't seem to be Egyptian names. They're written in what's known as syllabic orthography or group writing, which is this special form of Egyptian writing that developed to record the names of foreign individuals in foreign places. So just by the way it's written, we can tell these are not native Egyptian names. And in many cases, they are they seem to resemble known Semitic names. Like there's a guy whose name like looks like it should be Levi, probably. And another guy whose name like could be like Cain or Cain or something like that. So like names that look very similar to other Semitic names that we even know from the Bible. So there's a lot of evidence that there were Semitic speaking individuals there in the Middle Kingdom. New Kingdom, a couple references here and there, not really the sort of wealth of evidence that we have for the Middle Kingdom. I think there's maybe one or two inscriptions that mention individuals from the Levant during the New Kingdom. Definitely not what we have in the Middle Kingdom. So Gardner's argument is that, to have people write these inscriptions in a Semitic language, you need Semitic speaking people. Based on the Egyptian inscriptions, the Middle Kingdom is where we have the greatest sort of concentration of Semitic speaking individuals at the site. And sort of subsequently, there's been a lot of back and forth between these two options, right? New Kingdom, Middle Kingdom. Gardner's dating fell out of favor for a long time. W.F. Albright really came down hard and said, these are from the New Kingdom, looking at kind of the typology of the sphinxes that some of the inscriptions were on. Subsequently, though, with more data, we now know that you can also have these sort of type of sphinxes from the Middle Kingdom as well. So the Middle Kingdom date, definitely possible. And particularly with the discovery of the Wadi al-Hol inscriptions in the 90s and their publication in the 2000s, I think people, for the most part, are coming back around to a Middle Kingdom date for these inscriptions. The Wadi al-Hol inscriptions, again, not in a great archaeological context that would allow an archaeological dating, but again, we have sort of a contextual dating that we can do, similar to what we do for Sarabit al-Khadim. So one of the Egyptian inscriptions from Wadi al-Hol is by this guy called Bebi, who's called General of the Asiatics. So he's a military leader of some sort, and he's in charge of a contingent of Semitic speaking or people of Levantine origin under his command. And he leaves a couple inscriptions there, one of which actually has a date formula in it, which is nice. So it tells us when he was there, approximately. And again, kind of using that same logic, right, that to have an inscription in a Semitic language, you need people who speak a Semitic language there to produce it. The Wadi al-Hol inscriptions have been dated to the Middle Kingdom, which is when these inscriptions from Bebi, General of the Asiatics, date. And with that kind of led to a reevaluation of the dating of the Sarabit material. I mean, there was a little bit of reevaluation once we had the more sphinxes that we could compare Sinai 345, Sinai 346 to. But really, Wadi al-Hol is what kind of, I think, pushed most people to say, yeah, these probably aren't from the New Kingdom. Like, we have these other inscriptions. They look pretty similar. We can use kind of a similar dating on them.
So the Middle Kingdom, that's about 2000 BC-ish to 1700 BC-ish. Is that
approximately? Yeah. I mean, the dates vary a little bit. What's nice about the Wadi al-Hol material, or not the Wadi al-Hol, the Sarabit al-Khadim material, is that a lot of the inscriptions are dated that mention these men of retinue, Asiatics, people with Semitic names or people with names in group writing. They're dated to the reigns of particular pharaohs, so we can narrow things down even further. So most of actually, I think all of the inscriptions that mention this Habidadu, brother of the Prince of Retinue, are from the reign of Amenemhat III. So this would be about the middle of the 19th century, middle to the end. So we can, if we're willing to say, there seems to have been a lot of Semitic speakers here during the reign of Amenemhat III. This might be a likely context for the production of these inscriptions. You can arrive at a pretty specific date for the inscriptions from Sarabit.
And you're saying, and then the New Kingdom, Wikipedia says the 16th century to the 11th century. So, that's what most people think of as the Exodus. But then before that, the Middle Kingdom is like Abraham's time, right?
Yeah, approximately.
That.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and we can talk about this as well when we talk about the content, because, in earlier scholarship, particularly like under Albright, there really is this idea that also kind of persists today, but not necessarily in the mainstream of scholarship, that these inscriptions can kind of either not provide direct evidence, but maybe like indirect evidence of Israelites in Egypt, or something of that nature, right? They certainly provide evidence of Semitic speakers from the Levant in Egypt, but like for Albright, and then now kind of not necessarily in the mainstream, they provide like can provide us like sort of indirect evidence, particularly if these inscriptions are thought to date to the New Kingdom, which is what Albright thought, right? They're going to be, he thought they were like a little bit before the Exodus would happen, and so that they provide some sort of like window into the culture
Hmm.
of Semitic speakers in Egypt, and then sort of indirectly to Israelites living in
Hmm.
Egypt, and so that they could like almost be used as evidence for like ancient Israelite history and culture and religion and things like
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
that. There is as well. So yeah, some of these other um, like one-off inscriptions, like the Lahun Heddlejack was found in a tomb. The Derifa seal was found in a tomb. The Lakish dagger was found in a tomb. Like none of these were found, in contexts that are great for archaeological dating, particularly not with the methodology that was used at the time. The Lahun Heddlejack and the Derifa seal, I believe, are from Petrie's excavations. This is like at the very dawn of modern archaeology. Didn't have a lot of the tools, hadn't sort of developed the whole full methodology for like really excavating things in a way that would allow you to date them more specifically.
So what you're saying is that what? I mean, obviously, are you saying that we can't go back to the site and uncover more stuff, or um, things that are lost, or what do you like? What exactly about the ways that they did it don't allow for them to date it?
Um, yeah, like I think, and I'm not an archaeologist, so hopefully I don't say anything too out there. But like, I think in these early excavations, it's just like we just take everything and we take it out, right? Um, and not using some like modern techniques, so like sifting of dirt. They're really focused on kind of like large macroscopic
Oh wow.
objects and not like sifting to find small things, unless they're like really obviously there. But like, they're just like removing a bunch of dirt or like a bunch of debris, not really studying it in detail.
Mm.
The documentation is, not um, fully kind of like up to the modern level with, like the different squares and you have like the different loci. It'll just be like, yeah, this was found in this tomb, as opposed to like it was found in this corner of this tomb, like this far down, in the debris. Um,
Oh, yep.
yeah, so kind of problematic, right? For being able to assign some of these objects to like a particular stratum within the site, and because the methods that were used were kind of like really intensive, like taking a bunch of the material out, like really moving things around, not leaving um, material behind for later excavators to look at, which is
Hmm.
kind of like one of the hallmarks of more modern archaeology, right? Like you don't just like completely remove all the dirt from the site, right? Like you leave some areas for later excavations to excavate. Um, like because it was so intensive, like there's not really in a lot of cases much for people to go back and excavate, unfortunately,
Hmm.
um, which is problematic for dating. Um,
Sure.
because there's like a lot of doubt, or there's a lot of different possibilities for the dating of these early alphabetic inscriptions, until uh, this recent sherd from Lakish, the earliest inscription that had kind of like a secure archaeological dating that was could be dated by archaeological context, was from the 13th century. So the um, what is it called, the Lakish bowl, I think. Lakish has yielded like a ton of inscriptions. Like they just keep finding more and more. So this also seems to be like an important site for Um, Early alphabetic, like probably slightly later than Sarabit al Khadim and Wadi al Hol based on the forms of the letters, but
Hmm.
still a very important site for the production of alphabetic text, right? You have the Lakish dagger, the Lakish bowl. Um, it's hard to keep track of all of them. There's like the Lakish fragment, the Lakish sherd, they're just a bunch. So the one that was published 2 years ago is from a secure archaeological context, probably from the 15th century. But until that was published, the oldest securely datable or archaeologically datable inscription is from the 13th century. And so one scholar in particular, Benjamin Sass, said like, look, we know this is from the 13th century. If we date these early alphabetic inscriptions from Sarabit, from Wadi al Hol to like the 19th century, which is kind of like what context may suggest, right? With the references to Semitic speakers at these sites coming primarily from the 19th century, we have a gap of 600 years where we don't like, there doesn't really seem to be a ton of early alphabetic inscriptions that we can kind of place there. So why don't we just move these up from the 19th century to, the 14th century even? So pretty radical redating based on, having this large gap of time where there's not a lot of inscriptional material. The publication of this new Lakish sherd, would have to push back about 200 years. It closes the gap a little bit, but in my opinion, at least, when we're studying antiquity, like having these large gaps of time where you don't have evidence of something is pretty common. Even in more recent times, like there was kind of a similar push in medieval studies to like move the dates. It's this whole crazy thing. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. But someone said, oh, that Charlemagne like moved up the calendar 200 years. Rather than saying, well, it's the Middle Ages, right? Like we don't have all of the evidence. Maybe there just really isn't all that much evidence for like these 200 years. So I don't think that this gap. Well, one, I think it's getting closed, right, with the finds of more inscriptions like the Lakish sherd. There are some inscriptions, I think, like the Lakish dagger, can be dated typologically based on the shape of the dagger, I think. And that probably dates to like the 17th century. So like there isn't as large of a gap as there was necessarily between the likely Middle Kingdom date of the inscriptions from Sarabit al Khadim and Wadi al Hol and more securely datable inscriptions. So yeah, there's still a little bit of a debate going on. Yeah, now it's not so much like Middle Kingdom versus New Kingdom. It's more, and I mean, I guess Sass's proposal would put these in like the late New Kingdom, as opposed to like the earlier New Kingdom when Albright thought they dated. So it's like a little bit different than the Middle Kingdom versus New Kingdom debate. But I think for the most part, most people think these are Middle Kingdom in date, as opposed to New Kingdom now.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add? I got a couple questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
Okay. So most people probably aren't familiar with early alphabetic inscriptions and all that. So what I was hoping to do is just maybe 5 minutes or less, just talk about the different little inscriptions we have of like the alphabet and like I guess just maybe a really brief survey of just like maybe how they changed or whatever. Any thoughts on that?
yeah, absolutely. So, what we see in what are presumably the earliest, so inscriptions, so Wadi al Hol, Sarabit al Khadim, the letters are like very pictographic, to the point where you can recognize what they are a lot of the time,
Hmm.
right? So, um, the Aleph is in the shape of a bull's head, and you can still even see that like in the modern uppercase A. Like if you flip it upside down, you've got the triangular head and the two horns, but in the earliest inscriptions, like it's really detailed. It has like an eye. Sometimes it even has like ears. horn, like um, maybe a muzzle, and in a couple cases it's unclear, whether there's like a mark like near the nose, if this is just like a scratch or if this was intentional. Um, the hay, very pictographic. I mean, it's like still a stick figure, right? But like it has like a head and like arms and legs. Um, so very highly pictographic, particularly compared to later inscriptions like Hebrew inscriptions from like the Iron Age, where in most cases, like unless you know what it's supposed to represent beforehand, you couldn't really tell like that it's even supposed to represent anything. That becomes very linear, very schematized, very standardized, right? To the point where like um, Aleph. I mean, it gets rotated, right? So there are all these rotations in the course of the development of letters. So it would be kind of like R capital A, but like turned on its side at an angle. So it's like, and then like a line, right? So pretty far away from like a really clear pictographic depiction of a
Right.
bull's head.
Hmm. Fascinating. Okay. And so can you talk about the difference between like a big one that's been talked about recently is the, you know, maybe Hebrew coming from like some Amorite language, right here. So, ancient Amorite language discovered. There were like two tablets, and they had you know what this is, right? I would assume.
Yeah, yeah, I saw the
Okay.
publication.
Yeah. Right. So, um, so this right here, like, is that wasn't considered a alphabet, correct? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's written in cuneiform, which is a mixed script. So yeah, I guess um, briefly, kind of the difference between cuneiform and hieroglyphics and alphabet. Well, in cuneiform, you have signs that represent syllables often. So, ba, bi, b, as well as what are known as logograms. So they're signs that stand for a whole word. So like there's ones like the first one you learn when you learn Akkadian is the Dingir sign, which just means God, and it's in the shape originally of a star. So like there's this connection between deities and stars
Hmm.
baked into the writing system, which is kind of cool. But um, you don't have that in an alphabetic system. So an alphabetic system, basically each sign represents a single sound, um, kind of the most fundamental building block of the language, right? So the Aleph sign, for example, represents for us, the descendant of it, it represents the ah sound. For the earliest users of the alphabet, for ancient Israelites in the Iron Age, this would have been what's known as a glottal stop. So this is um, it's not a distinctive sound in English. You wouldn't it wouldn't be in most words, but if you say like the word oh, right, it's that sound. So that's the sound that the Aleph originally made, the sort of like catch in your throat sound. The
Hmm.
bait, of course, makes the b sound, and so on, right? Like each sign makes one sound. There are enough sounds, or there are enough letters for all of the distinctive sounds in the language,
Mm.
with kind of a catch, right? The Semitic languages are built on a triconsonantal root system, right? So most words are built up of three consonants, plus or minus maybe some prefixes and suffixes, and you get vowels inserted in between, and these change
Right.
meaning, right? So you can have like melech, king, but malach, he ruled or he became king, where the vowels change the meaning, but sort of the root meaning of the word is
Mm.
contained in the consonants.
Mm.
And so, with these early alphabetic inscriptions, and continuing even into later Hebrew inscriptions from the Iron Age, most vowels aren't represented. And the earliest inscriptions, they're just not represented at all. They're not seen as like that important or distinctive, because it's the consonants that like contain the most important meaning of the
Mm.
words. Unfortunately, this makes these inscriptions much harder for us to read now because, for example, if you see MLK, an inscription like, is this king? Is this he ruled? You have a bunch of different possibilities depending on what the vowels are. So this makes the job of interpreting these inscriptions much more difficult, unfortunately.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, really cool. Okay. Um, yeah, so was there anything else besides context dating, content? I mean, or do you want to go into how we're able to read these?
Yeah, I think this is probably a good place to talk about how we're able to read these now that we sort of set the stage on how difficult this is.
Mm,
Um, I mean, even before we get to the challenge of like knowing what vowels should go with the consonants, knowing what the more specific meaning to give to the roots, we should probably talk about how are we able to even know what the consonantal values of these letters are. Um, and that's where this really helpful principle that seems to have been involved in the invention of the alphabet and then was later recognized by scholars comes into play. It's what's known as the acrophonic principle. And so, according to the acrophonic principle, or a system arranged according to the acrophonic principle, um, the values of the letters, the sound values of the letters, will correspond to the first sound in their name. So, Aleph, sorry, I tried to do the glottal stop sound. It has a glottal stop at the beginning of the word. Therefore, its value is the glottal stop. Maybe I should have used bait. That's a little bit easier to understand, right? So bait, it starts with a B, so its sound value is B, um, which is nice.
And just so we're on the same page, this is early alphabetic inscriptions, or specifically Hebrew, or
So this is a trait used to invent the alphabet, and then inherited by all sort of descendant traditions that come from that. So,
hmm,
um, all a lot of the I should nuance this a little bit. Most alphabets actually descend from this original alphabet that we first see attested in the early alphabetic inscription. So, Hebrew, Greek, the Roman characters that we use today. Um, yeah, I think those are kind of the main ones, but like a bunch of different alphabetic traditions. Oh, Arabic, of course. Um, all of these actually descend ultimately from one tradition,
hmm,
and we can tell this based on kind of the letter names that they inherit, right? So you have Aleph in Hebrew, Alpha in Greek, Aleph in Arabic. So they all have
hmm,
kind of the same names for the letters. And this ultimately is what allows us to assign a sound value, or is a big part of what allowed us to assign actual values to the pictographs that we see in the early alphabetic inscriptions. Um, because we have these traditions that have these letter names. I mean, what is Aleph? What is Alpha? To us, they don't really seem to have uh, any meaning. And a Greek speaker, right, who borrowed this tradition from the Phoenicians, like Alpha doesn't really necessarily mean anything. But if you look at the names in the different traditions, it's often possible to associate them with an actual word. So Aleph or Alif or Alpha, right, um, is the word for ox. It's Hebrew Aleph. The word bait is the word for house, and so on, right? You can do this with a lot of these, right? Mem is related to the Hebrew word mahim, water,
hmm,
and so like there actually seems to be words associated or related to these names. And when these early alphabetic inscriptions were first discovered, they're very pictographic. And so Gardner, who produced kind of the first attempt to, I guess, first successful attempt to identify a word in the inscriptions that we now kind of still consider correct today, said,
hmm,
okay, well, we have these pictographs that look like ox heads. Um, could this be Aleph, right? Aleph means, or is related to a word that means ox. Could we assign this the value of the glottal stop? We have these pictographs that look kind of like the floor plan of a house, seen from the top down. Usually they're square. Sometimes they actually have like an opening or a door. Could this be the bait? Could this be the bee? And he was able to do this for some of the pictographs to the point where he was able to recognize the word that's spelled Beit Ayin Lamed Tav, so Baalat, which is the feminine of Baal, so the lady. And he pointed out, in the Egyptian inscriptions from Serabit al-Khadim, they're always mentioning Hathor, and they're always calling her the Lady of Turquoise. And I think at that point, we had known that the Phoenicians called Hathor Baalat as well, or Baalat Gubal. They identified her with a goddess called Baalat, and he said, "Yeah, I think this is Baalat. I think this is the Semitic name for Hathor at Serabit al-Khadim." Then subsequently, through I think maybe like another 15, 16 years, better understanding of the letters, identification of the letters developed. And you have this very, very common expression in the Egyptian inscriptions that's beloved of Hathor, Lady of Turquoise. And you have this sequence that often occurs before the word the lady in the Egyptian or in the alphabetic inscriptions, I think about 7 times. That's Mem, Aleph, He, Beit. You have Aleph, He, Beit. This is Hebrew Achav, to love. And so this was identified ultimately in 1932 by the scholar Boutin. And he says, I think this is beloved. I think this is what would be the equivalent of a pual participle in Hebrew. So this is beloved of the lady. And kind of the nice proof of that is Sinai 345 that has Egyptian and alphabetic text on it. Egyptian text says, beloved of Hathor, Lady of Turquoise. And the alphabetic text says, beloved of the lady. So you have kind of a nice equivalence there that I think really says we're on the right track, like these values actually do work. Where we run into problems, or at least where the early people who worked on these inscriptions, early scholars who worked on these inscriptions ran into problems, is they thought that the Semitic language that these inscriptions recorded was like Hebrew, so that it only had 22 consonants. We now know, and maybe should have known, I'm not sure, that Hebrew already, as it was spoken in the Iron Age, actually had 25 consonants. The 22 consonants are because the Israelites borrowed the alphabet from the Phoenicians, who actually had 22 sounds in their language. Hebrew actually had 25, so some letters had to pull double duty. And you can see that today, even when you learn Hebrew, right? You have one character, the shin, or the sin, right, that you put a dot on one side or the other and it changes the value. So already right there, that tells you, hey, there are at least 23 sounds in Hebrew. And we just have a dot that distinguishes one. And the other 2 sounds you can see actually in the Septuagint, so the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, where words that have ein or chet in them in Hebrew are written 2 different ways. And when you correlate these with comparative linguistic data from languages that have preserved more sounds, like Arabic, right? Arabic has not just chet, but also het, and not just ein, but rein. You see, hey, the words that, in other languages have rein get written with a gamma, and the ones that have ein get written with nothing. And similar sort of thing with the het and the he. And so that's why I remember when I was learning Hebrew, this was kind of a surprise to me. What we call in English Gaza, right, is Aza in Hebrew. It's written with an ein. but it was really Rein. So it gets written with a gamma in Hebrew, and so that's why it's Gaza in English. So, um, this was a problem for these early decipherers, the early scholars working on these inscriptions, that they thought, hey, this language only has 22 sounds. Well, there are more than 22 symbols um, in the text. And so it was Albright who first realized, hey, other Semitic languages from this time period have larger inventories of sounds. And so we need to kind of like expand our horizons beyond the Phoenician inventory of sounds and consider that there are other letters. This, of course, then becomes a problem, though, for using the acrophonic principle to assign values to those letters, because for the most part, these traditions of letter names all kind of go through Phoenician ultimately. And that means we only have 22 names. So that makes it very hard to then work backwards and say, okay, well, I know the value of, or that the name of this letter means this, and I can find a pictograph to match it up with, and so I can assign a particular sound to it. So it did, this recognition that there are more than 22 sounds represented, or more than 22 letters represented in these inscriptions, was a huge breakthrough, but it also makes things much more challenging because
Hmm.
we don't necessarily have the names for those letters.
Sorry, did that on accident. Really interesting stuff. Okay. Um, so maybe you can, maybe you can't. This is putting you on the spot here. Um, so like if we were to say, hey, um, reading from the top here, we have, the Aleph, which is the bull, and I guess this is what Mayim maybe, or not Mayim, but I don't know, whatever. Is that a snake or water? I don't know. Um,
Yeah,
okay.
that's the snake.
And then I recognize the equal symbol, but whatever it is, like, so how would someone translate this? Like, is this just one word at the top here, or is there multiple words, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I think, and this is an inscription that I've written about, so I have luckily a little bit of a better understanding of this one. Um, so I think at least I had proposed, and this is parts of this go back to Albright, but I've provided my own spin on it. So um, first we have Aleph Nun Tav, or glottal stop NT. And this is the second person pronoun. So this would be Hebrew atah, you. Then the equal sign, this is one of the kind of extra letters that was recognized to exist. So in terms of its form, this becomes Zion. It looks very similar to the Zions that we get in later inscriptions, from ancient Israel, from Phoenicia, or from the Phoenician city-states, Aramaic, things like that. But it doesn't have a Z sound. It has this, it's called an ev. So it's the beginning sound in the word the. So it's the. And this is the relative pronoun. So it's you, who, and then after that we get another one of these sort of bonus letters. This looks very similar to the Hebrew shin, later Hebrew shin, but it occurs in words that, based on comparison with other languages, didn't have the sh, or the s sound that
Hmm.
shin represents. So Hebrew shin, that sh sound actually represents, not represents, two different sounds coalesced into one. So two sounds that were separate originally merged over time in Hebrew. So you have the normal S sound, or the sh sound, and then you have the th sound, like in think. Um, and this particular sign, which is probably a compound bow, um, only seems to occur in words that would have originally had the th in them, as opposed to the s
Hmm.
or the sh. So this is the um, letter for th. And then, as you can see in this drawing, there's a lot of damage to this tablet. So there's probably another
Hmm.
letter there at the end. Um, Albright, I believe, restored an ein, or the, let's see if I can do the sound ein. It's a very difficult sound to produce. Um, but the I there, and uh, read it as you who, and then this the and the ein in Ugaritic means to sacrifice or to offer a sacrifice. So he thought it meant, and I think he used kind of uh, biblically type language. That was something like "Thou, O offerer," or something like that. Um, and I think instead of restoring an ein here in this broken spot, if you restore a bait, then you get this thon plus bait, which would be the early alphabetic form of Hebrew shuv, which is to return. Um, and a common phrase in the Egyptian inscriptions from Serebit al-Khatam is to say, "Oh, you who have returned to the site," right? These inscriptions are addressed to individuals who will later come to the site, read the inscriptions, and hopefully, or at least it's the hope of the people who wrote these inscriptions, perform a sacrifice or do some sort of memorial action of some sort. And given the other kind of close parallels that we have between the early alphabetic inscriptions from Serebit al-Khatam and the Egyptian inscriptions, right? The correspondence between beloved of Hathor and beloved of the lady. This inscription as well, Sinai 349, the author has taken the time, or the creator has taken the time to kind of carve out this stela shape in the rock face, which can't have been easy. And this is actually quite common. I think there may be 7, 8, 9 inscriptions where the creator has taken the time to either draw the shape of a stela around the entire inscription, or even like carve away to create almost like this relief stela shape. Um, and this is like the most common form for the Egyptian inscriptions from Serebit al-Khatam to take these incredible freestanding stela that are several feet high, that were kind of like in the courtyard of the temple, the Hathor. So, anybody who went to the site when it was active, when the temple was active, would see all of these Egyptian stela shaped inscriptions. And if you're thinking, hey, this is the way you write an inscription, like it needs to be stela shaped, like presumably you would also carry that over in the alphabetic
Mm.
inscriptions as well. So I think the phraseology, having parallels in the phraseology is to be expected as well. We already have some. We have parallels in kind of the material form of the inscriptions. The stela shape is very important. And so having something like "you who have returned" here, mimicking the Egyptian inscriptions, makes
Okay,
sense
so just
as
so we're on
well.
the same page here. So, I'm sure you said this, but my lack of intelligence here on this topic probably made me miss it. So, are you saying like, is this one word or multiple words up the top here, or what? How would you?
Yeah, I think if you divide it, it would end up being
Oh,
three
okay.
words. So you would divide it here after the plus sign, so the tav, and then you divide it again after the
Mm,
equal sign, and then there would be
yeah.
restored some letter here at the end, and that would be the third letter. So, um, yeah, this is another challenge to interpreting these inscriptions, that there's no indication of where one word ends and another word begins. Um, there's
Yeah.
no spacing. And we can see this even more clearly, and get kind of an idea of how the creators of these inscriptions kind of
Mm,
conceptualized writing in the way they write that very common phrase, beloved of the lady, right? So the word beloved, because it's from the root aleph, hey, bait, it ends with bait. and the word the lady, ba'alat, begins with a bait. And in the majority of the cases of the writing of this expression, you only have one bait. It's kind of doing double duty for the end of one word and the beginning of the other word, um, which kind of gives you an idea that they hadn't, like when we read today, right? We have all these things to help us, right? We have the layout of the text, we have spacing, we have punctuation, so that writing is pretty far removed from speaking, right? Like when you're speaking, it's a continuous flow of sound. And for these early alphabetic inscriptions, it seems that the act of writing is still pretty closely aligned with speaking,
Yeah.
to the point where things like, combining these words, because in speech, right? If you said something like balat, right? The bait is, slightly longer, but or that b sound is slightly longer, right? Because there are two of them, but they're right next to each other, and so you can write it with one bait. You don't necessarily need to like put both there.
That is extremely fascinating. Wow. Okay. I got my money's worth on that question. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so it's about hitting that hour mark. As I said, I'm good to go for as long as you want. But as far as like questions go, I mean, we have what can we infer about the invention of the alphabet from these inscriptions, and what does any of this tell us about the identity of the alphabet's inventors? So we can talk about that, or if you don't want to, or I don't know how long that would take in your eyes. So, what are your thoughts?
I think I could
Go.
talk about it briefly, and it might be a nice way to kind of
Cool.
wrap things up,
Yeah.
if that's
Yeah.
all right with you. I mean, um, yeah. So in terms of sorry, the first one
Yeah.
was
So yeah.
um,
Just in continuation, what can we infer about the invention of the alphabet from these different types of inscriptions here?
yeah, that's a great question. So um, one other component of the acrophonic principle is the letters are pictographic, so they represent like once you know the name of the pictograph, then you can very easily infer the value of the letter, which is really convenient for learning this. But the thing is where did the inventors of the alphabet, or where did these pictographs
Mm,
seem to come from, right? Like they could have chosen, there are a bunch of different words that start with a glottal stop. There are a bunch of words that start with a B. How do you pick? Um, and there seems to be a close correspondence for most of the letters in the early alphabetic inscriptions, where they correspond to a hieroglyph in the
mm,
Egyptian system. So, like, there is a hieroglyph that's a bull's head, has a completely different value. It's a usually a logogram, meaning bull or cow. There's a logogram for house, and so on. So the pictographs seem to have been picked out of the Egyptian system, um, but given completely different values, um, which tells us a couple of things, right? So we know that these inscriptions are in a Semitic language. All of the words that we can
mm-hmm.
identify seem to be Semitic, right? We have the word, the lady, Ba'alat. In that inscription we looked at, Sinai 349, we have the second masculine singular pronoun, anta, or what would become Hebrew ata. So, yeah, everything seems to be Semitic, but the shapes of the letters seem to be borrowed from hieroglyphs, or maybe hieratic, which is the cursive form of Egyptian that's written with pen and ink on papyrus, or there's kind of like a mix. Like, so hieroglyphs are like what's written in rock and like really fancy monumental inscriptions, and hieratic is like, I'm doing my taxes, like I need to go fast. I'm going to use pen and paper, and it's meant to write fast. It's much less pictographic. It's very hard, in fact, a lot of the time to identify, you know, the letters with specific real world objects like you can with hieroglyphics. Um, then there's kind of like an intermediate form where it's like okay, these aren't like the best of the best monument carvers. They're, maybe more used to writing in hieratic, and so you get hieratic features in hieroglyphics. So it's what's known as cursive hieroglyphic system. So kind of running the gamut there, you have like correspondences between um, the shapes of the letters used in the early alphabetic inscriptions and like either hieroglyphics or cursive hieroglyphics, a little bit less so. I mean, some forms do seem to be a little bit more akin to their hieratic forms, but there is kind of, it does seem likely that whoever created the system borrowed heavily from the Egyptian system, or was familiar. And so from that already we can kind of infer that this is uh, a situation of cultural contact between Semitic speakers, and they have to have access to the Egyptian script somewhere, like have to be able to see it and interact with it. Of course, you know that there's this whole debate about whether the inventors of the alphabet could read the Egyptian script or whether they couldn't. With Orly Goldwasser saying, I think these people couldn't read Egyptian. And I think she makes some good points. And I think, this is another thing that we can kind of like infer from the early alphabetic inscriptions, because the signs that they chose from Egyptian, the letters of the alphabet, have very little relationship to they were only chosen for the pictograph. They weren't chosen for their sound value at all, right? So the pictograph
Yeah.
of a house in Egyptian has the value pair, which is not really a buh at all. So one would think, presumably, right, that if they were well versed in this
Yeah.
Egyptian system and they knew the values of these signs, I mean, there is a sign that has the value buh in Egyptian. It's a foot. Why didn't they choose that or something like that? And I guess you could say, well, they wanted to have this mnemonic relationship in their own language, so they had to choose like signs that were, um, that would have the appropriate value in a Semitic language. But then why bother with Egyptian at all? Like, why you could just pick your own. So like, it seems like that they knew of Egyptian, that this is like some sort of um, prestigious form of writing for them, but they're not um, necessarily fully like competent in it in a way that would you know the distribution of pictographs doesn't reflect what we would expect if they were fully competent in Egyptian. They could have picked many different pictographs if they knew Egyptian. So that kind of the mix of pictographs that are used in the system, I think, tells us. I think Goldwasser's proposal is pretty persuasive that these individuals probably weren't literate in hieroglyphics or any Egyptian writing system. But certainly, the minimum that we can tell is that they were Semitic speakers. They interacted a lot with Egyptian. And so, this helps us narrow down, well, where did the invention take place, right? It has to have been someplace where there were people speaking a Semitic language, and those people could have interactions. They could view the Egyptian script in some way. And for a while, before the discovery of the Wadi al-Hol inscriptions, it was some scholars had proposed that Sarabit al-Khadim itself was the site of the invention, because you have a ton of the alphabetic inscriptions, you have a ton of Egyptian inscriptions, you have this interaction where Semitic speakers can see all of these, lovely stelae in the court of the Temple of Hathor. Maybe they thought, hey, we want to do that, and we're going to come up with a writing system to be able to do that. With the discovery of the Wadi al-Hol inscriptions and the realization that you basically have early alphabetic inscriptions from two sites that are pretty far apart, right? You have one in the Sinai Peninsula, you have one like in the middle of Egypt. These are roughly contemporary. They're both from the reign of Amenemhat III, most likely. means Cerebral Khatam probably not where the alphabet was invented, unless it's invented even earlier. And so now you can say, well, it's got to be a site where you can kind of like maybe equidistant from Cerebral Khatam and Wadi al Hol. So one suggestion for the site of the invention is the Nile Delta, because you can just follow the Nile down to get to Wadi al Hol, and the expeditions from Cerebral Khatam left from the Nile Delta. And we do have evidence from the Middle Kingdom, from Avaris, or the modern name Tel El Daba, of a significant Semitic-speaking population in the Delta. So that would be kind of nice. There's even, I believe, a scarab seal from Tel El Daba that says the Prince of Rishnu on it. So you have at Cerebral Khatam, the brother of the prince, and in the Delta, you have the Prince of Rishnu, which is kind of cool. So, this is, we don't, one scenario that we can envision, right, is that the Prince of Rechenu is at Tel El Daba, and he sends his brother to Cerebral Khatam and says, give me some turquoise. Because this scarab seal is like found in this like really nice, I think it's not a house, I think it's been interpreted like as a depot, almost like a trading depot that like has all these like really nice sort of what at the time would have been luxury products. And so they're involved in gathering these luxury products for like not export, but like to take them back to the Levant.
Really cool stuff. So I mean, I guess I could see it like when we're asking, like, you know, did they have these inscriptions in mind, the hieroglyphics in mind when they're writing? I mean, you did mention that, there was like Egyptian temples next to the mining site. So like maybe they could have it in reference in the back of their head when they're writing. Or, I mean, are you thinking that like maybe these people would run over to the temple real quick, look at it, run back? I mean, is that even a possible scenario and how this works? Um, or maybe even like you said that they made trips during the year, so maybe they could reference the Egyptian uh, marking hieroglyphics then, and then they have it in the back of their head. Does any of that make sense? Is any of that possible as far as how that worked and how they thought about all the writings and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So I think at the time of the invention, certainly, there's a lot of interaction looking at Egyptian inscriptions. Like, I got to pick out, I have, anywhere from like 25 to 29 sounds that I need to represent to
Mm-hmm.
create this system. Like, I need to pick out things, and I'm going to look at, what this dominant writing system is. I think by the time we get to Sarabit al Khadim and Wadi al Hol, it's a little bit more disconnected from the Egyptian system. Like it's its own system now. And what's nice about the acrophonic principle is that it like is very good for remembering what letters go with what sound, right? Like you just need to say, okay, like, and there may have even been like an alphabet song or like some sort of like mnemonic device, right? Like ox, house, throw stick, all of the different words that you need
Uh,
to remember to then be able to draw, which is like really nice. Like you don't, with the Roman alphabet that we use today, right? Like there's not really this like nice connection between the shape of the letter and
mm-hmm.
what sound it's supposed to produce. Like there's nothing like inherently a like about
Yeah.
the letter A. Um, but you know, as long as you can remember, okay, the word ox starts with the sound. Um, I just need to draw an ox or the head of an ox to be able to represent that sound. The word or the sound b is in bait, so I just need to draw a house, right? And so it's really nice for being able to um, remember what letters go with what
Yeah, sure.
sounds.
Okay. And so last question, most likely, what does any of this tell us about the identity of the alphabet's inventors? Where'd they come from? Were they literate in another writing system? Did you already answer that question?
I think I've touched on it a little bit, yeah, but I can talk about it
Okay.
a little bit more as well. I mean, so um, presumably the inventors spoke a Semitic language. We can tell that just based on the way they used Semitic words to come up with the values for the letters. We also know this from the earliest inscriptions being, from what we can read at least, in a Semitic language, which is nice. Um, they, as I said, probably had some interaction with Egyptian writing system, whether this is just
Mm,
viewing it in some context or actually writing it themselves. So yeah, it's and this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this topic, right? Is it's cultural contact between people from the Levant and Egypt producing this new thing, which is the
mm,
alphabet.
very cool. All right. These would be super, super quick questions. Um,
Mhm.
what is cursive hieroglyphic? So I'm looking at this. This is something you've been talking about a lot. But what is cursive about this? What makes it cursive?
So yeah, like if you think, I mean, uh, cursive is meant to be written fast, right? Or at least that was the idea. I don't know if you had to learn cursive in grade
I
school.
did, yes.
Yeah, me too. And then I never
Right,
used it
exactly.
again. But I think the idea is that it's supposed to be faster than writing
Okay.
unconnected. Um, and so this cursive hieroglyphic is, they're not taking the time to, very painstakingly carve monumental style
Mm-hmm.
letters, that are very pictographic. This is much more hurried, and in a lot of cases you can't even really recognize what these are supposed to be. Like I think on the left there's maybe the sitting man, but these become very
Yeah.
abstract, and so yeah, it's just hieroglyphics that are written more
Mm-hmm.
quickly and become more
Yeah.
abstract as a
So,
result.
and are there letters, a bunch of letters touching here? Is that a big part of it?
Um, I think there might be a couple. So yeah, it is. So unlike like English
Mm-hmm.
cursive or cursive Roman alphabet, where you write letters connected, I think there are fewer ligatures, connections of
Mm-hmm.
deliberate connections of letters here to the same extent. But yeah, it is meant to be written much more quickly than sort of
Mm-hmm. And
monumental
that's kind of
hieroglyphics.
similar to another question, which is, um, what what about letters that when they touch, what is the significance of that? Like, does that happen often? Is that rare? Does that often tell us if there's two letters touching, does that mean that really it's not even a letter at all, or what does that say?
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question because we do have in some of the inscriptions from Serabit al Khatam, there's at least one famous case where two letters do seem to be touching, and um, what that tells me, I think at least, because it's in a inscription that has two columns, and it's at the very bottom of one of the columns, and this tells me at least that the person who wrote this was running out of space, and they needed to write the two letters very close together to be able to
Yeah.
fit
Oh,
everything
that's
in.
funny.
Um, yeah, so they wrote basically a lamed and a tav, um, just like they use the tail of the
Yeah.
tav and then put like a line to make um, the tav.
Interesting. Okay. And one last question here. Very last question. So when we're talking
Mhm.
about
Sure.
variation, I mean, you're talking about people that are technically not literate, at least in Egyptian, if they're writing early alphabetic inscriptions, and maybe they were, I guess, literate in their own, uh, you know, proto language or whatever, early alphabetic. At that point, so when we're like when we're trying to decipher a text, like how much variation is there? Like, is it all over the place? Is it usually pretty finite? When we're looking at a random text and we're trying to figure it out, um, like how do we determine like if this is just like some made up letter or not a letter at all, or is this just a really badly written Aleph?
Yeah, I mean that's really the challenge for some of these
Mm,
corner cases. So for the most part, I would say there is variation, but it's like within a certain
mm,
range. So you can usually tell um, when something is an Aleph or when something is a bait. Um, of course, there are corner cases, and the other problem is that at Sorbet Khadim, at least, all of these inscriptions are in sandstone, which is very
mm,
fragile. And so there was damage to the inscription from like wind or
mm,
rain, in the thousands of years since they
mm,
were first written. There's also been damage to the inscriptions since they've been
mm,
discovered. Unfortunately, I think Petrie mentions in the initial publication that um, one of them it fell from the camel that they were transporting it on and broke in 4 pieces. So they've kind of had a hard life, and so in some cases, particularly where the surface is very abraded or it's an uncommon letter, it's not one of the ones that occurs very
uh,
commonly. It can be a challenge to say, yes, I know exactly what
uh,
that letter is. I know what its value should be. So it can get
mm.
tricky,
Very, very
certainly.
fascinating. Okay, all right. So what I want you to do is I want you to give people just how to access your work, how they can maybe even follow you in the future, or um, maybe even a little advertisement for your book, and maybe we even can talk about that book some other time. Just really
Sure.
quick,
Yeah.
just let everyone know about yourself.
Yeah. So main place you can find my work is academia.edu slash, I think, Aren Wilson-Wright, or maybe Aren M. Wilson-Wright. I don't remember if I include the middle initial in there. That's got a lot of my articles there. I also have a Google Scholar page as
Sweet.
well that has
All right.
links to
And
those.
then the book, what's the name? Give us that look.
Yeah, Jeremiah's
Sweet.
Egypt, and this, I mean, it's you can get a physical copy. I believe it's also open access through
Awesome.
SBL Press, so
Yeah.
you can just download a
Sweet.
PDF of
Awesome.
that
All
as
right.
well.
Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun, and I've really appreciated you talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you so
Awesome.
much for having me on.